It's officially Comic-Con after hours, so who here's hammered?
Yes!
Whoops. My kind of people. We wanted to kick off, well, for starters, welcome and thank you for coming to the Psychology of Star Trek versus Star Wars, Episode 2. By the way, for clarification, that's not all of Star Trek versus just Attack of the Clones. So, just kidding. It's, this is actually round 2. It's a rematch of sorts between two of these, or the two psychologists on the panel. They started off this really popular series at WonderCon this year, and they weren't quite done. So we decided to pitch it to Comic-Con, a much larger convention, and a much larger potential for bloodshed between the two factions. So I like what I'm seeing here. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. She has a PhD in clinical psychology. She has spoken at several conventions about trauma, resilience, and psychological recovery amongst comic book, well, fictional heroes and villains in general. She's also the curator of a website underthemaskonline.com, where she goes on and on about all the psychological stuff you want to know about your favorite heroes and villains. And her real passions live in Gotham City and in a galaxy far, far away. Dr. Andrea Letamendi. He is. Oh, I'm sorry. And there's a photo of you.
And Batman.
The
Apparently.
Gotham portion.
He's like eerily looking at me.
He is an author. He is an author. You can find his next book this year. It is a pulpy sci-fi Western novel called The Serpent's Head. He's also a journalist, having walked the Star Wars beat for more than 5 years as the editor-in-chief of Big Shiny Robot. He's also written for Star Wars Insider and the official Star Wars website. Mr. Brian Young. He's also one of the hottest geek guys of 2013.
You guys used that photo?
I know, right? Yeah.
Okay.
It's Comic-Con After Dark.
Yes.
This gentleman is, he is the co-producer and co-host of Mission Log, the podcast from Roddenberry Entertainment. It analyzes every episode of Star Trek over its 45 plus years. He's also the co-producer and co-host of DVD Geeks.
Yeah.
Just one. He's also a
Star Trek panel is off. It's all DVD.
He's also quite the accomplished commercial and corporate video production artist. Really is what it comes down to. Having worked on bonus features for both Shout Factory, if you were in the panel before that, you know that name, and also with CBS on the Star Trek Next Generation Blu-rays as well as the Enterprise Blu-rays, Mr. John Champion. Finally, the other psychologist on the panel. He's known around the country as the Jedi Knight of Psychology. Maybe not.
That's cool. That's
Maybe
cool.
didn't.
It's a lot cooler title than what we had in Star Trek.
Star Trek.
Like Yeoman.
Let's start keeping tabs now on.
He's also completing his postdoctoral fellowship at the NYU Langone Medical Center. And in his free time, likes to write for BrainnKnowsBest.com in hopes that it creates a love for psychology, similar to what Star Trek did for him. So, Dr. Ali Mattu. This is sort of how this one works. We're going to throw out a series of questions to you guys. Psychologists have the book learning, and our two experts can help them out with a lot of the canon, and not that they need a lot of the help, but we like to have 4 people on the panel. And they're 4 great people. So we're going to ask you guys a series of questions. We'll start out with one team. The other team gets an opportunity to respond. All the back and forth just takes time. So think of your answers wisely before we move on. And then we'll open it up to a Q&A. And at the end of the night, one of these two franchises will walk out of here, crown the victor of Comic-Con 2013. If it's any, if you need any backstory, Star Trek may have eked out a win at WonderCon. So they're out for, Star Wars is out for blood.
Yeah.
All right, so in the immortal words of the late great Apollo Creed, ding, ding. Round one, Vulcan versus Jedi. Now we both know that these two cultures very much into harnessing the emotions, particularly that of anger. Which one do you think, psychologically speaking, leads to a more healthy way of... They're answering the questions. Which one do you think leads to a healthier way of life? We'll actually start with Team Wars.
Can I just jump in here? Can I quickly just ask, who's here for Star Wars? Yeah! Okay.
Dear God.
Who's here for Star Trek?
It might always be best to err on the side of not doing that, just in case.
I know. Well, so let's jump into this first question. I think that what comes to mind as far as these sort of two ways of regulating emotion, the Jedi actually are doing it right, and I'll explain why.
No, she didn't.
There's actually a science behind this. So what the Jedi are actually doing is they're regulating their emotions. So they're using their ability to cultivate and embrace positive emotions, usually for pro-social reasons. And they do experience negative emotions like anger and fear and all that stuff. And they know that if you operate on those negative emotions, that leads to the dark side, which could be, antisocial behavior and other things that are not pro-social. So they actually learn to cultivate positive emotions and sort of they manage negative emotions. They don't totally avoid them, but they recognize them, they identify them, and then they manage them. Whereas the Vulcan folk, the Vulcan folk,
They're a species, Andrea. They're not folk.
They actually, it would be different if they didn't have the capacity to experience emotions, but they do. And their culture avoids and represses all emotion. And we know as psychologists that when you repress emotion and inhibit all of these emotions, that it actually can sort of build up. And, it sort of makes sense that after a very long time, that can lead to distress and sort of this negative experience. And, this whole Ponfar business is just an example of how crazy things can get if you do not allow yourself to experience those emotions.
I think when you look at Jedi versus Vulcan, I think because they are a completely different species, they're not a very good model for people to try to glean lessons from, because we're not built biologically or physiologically like they are or portend to be. And Jedi are human, presumably, but they don't, anybody can be a Jedi of any species, and so they're much more inclusive. So that line of thought is a lot better.
All right, so first of all, you cannot knock the Ponfar until you've tried it. All right?
This is true.
It's very true. All right.
This does not seem right to me.
And we have to understand that the Vulcans are seething with emotion. They can barely keep the emotion under wraps. So they learned a long, long time ago that they have to work actively to keep this repressed, or else it would lead to their own undoing. And let's look at what they've accomplished. Vulcan has never been conquered. They have advanced in sciences. And this is a meme that I will come back to later. Science greater than magic. And I say that, I say that, first of all, I say that with provocation and without qualification, okay? So the Vulcans they have excelled at what they have chosen to do. And there is some voluntary aspect of this. We know that Spock decided to go through Kolinar. Found out it wasn't for him. He had a more balanced life when he embraced his emotional side. So to say that it's a one-size-fits-all plan is not entirely true. And yeah, it's not necessarily meant to apply to humans, but they are very good there as foils for humans to help us see our logical sides when we need to embrace that logical side. Doctor, I defer to you.
Thank you, Mr. Champion. So let's back up a second. Why do we even have emotions? Emotions give us information very, very quickly. So anger tells you you've been wronged in some way. Anxiety warns you about some type of danger. Sadness tells you that there's been some type of loss. And here, Dr. Letamendi, this is my issue with the Jedi. You just said, repression is a very bad thing, we should not do this. Who said this? Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. The Jedi have big problems with negative emotions. One of the biggest problems that we see with our patients is a intolerance of emotions, intolerance of thoughts that are aversive. The Jedi come out and say, yes, be mindful, be in the present moment, but not when it comes to negative emotions. Now, I'm going to talk about Vulcans. Now, Vulcans have very, very powerful emotions, and they use a logic-based meditation to manage those emotions. What does that mean? I really don't know. I don't know what the logic-based meditation is. All I know is there's a lot of crazy Vulcan spirituality. And, you know, I think Kolinar at the end of the day is really just kind of like a bar mitzvah.
Yeah.
I don't think anything actually really happens. It just sort of celebrating and
Spock got a check for like $100.
Yeah, he has to do a reading from the book of I don't know. But so here's the thing: mindfulness, being fully in the present moment, being able to tolerate whatever thoughts and feelings you're having, good or bad. That is the best way to handle emotions. And my friends, there is one character in both genres, both franchises, who is the embodiment, the epitome of mindfulness. It's not a Jedi. It's not a Vulcan. His name is Captain Jean-Luc Picard.
Yeah. Always got to whip out the Picard. All right, so fair. You guys weigh in at the end. Round two, we're going to go with Borg versus Sith. Which one of these two villains really threatens the idea of humanity the most? We'll start with Team Trek.
All right, so a threat, anxiety, danger, it tells us two things. It tells us that there's uncertainty, something might happen that's unpredicted, that we're not expecting, and our lives are in danger. No one represents that better than the Borg. There's complete uncertainty. You don't know what they're going to adapt to. You don't know where they're going to come, when they're going to come from, what they're going to be doing. In many ways, I've got a theory about the Borg. So here's the thing. So you see the Borg in Next Generation, right? They're assimilating Jean-Luc Picard. Spoiler alert for those of you who haven't seen Best of Both Worlds.
I'm pretty sure the spoiler is actually on the screen.
Oh. I did not see that. So it takes them like an hour to get assimilated, like a long time, right? And then in First Contact, it's like nanotubes assimilated. But I think between Next Generation and First Contact, the Borg have assimilated zombies, and it allows them to have that really fast assimilation process. Anyways, the Borg are in many ways like zombies. Complete uncertainty, you don't know where they're gonna come from. And we've seen Borg in real life, this sort of losing all sense of identity and independence. We've done it to ourselves. They were called lobotomies. What you do is you lobotomize. We thought you take people with extreme mental illness, you cut off part of their frontal lobe, and now suddenly they're behaving fine, but they were complete zombies. They weren't able to do anything. There's nothing more terrifying than that. Taking away the sense of humanity, the very part of ourselves that is so different and so unique compared to every ever animal species. I am going to say something, though, that I'm very ashamed of, but I think this is a very welcoming crowd. Has anyone here seen Captain EO? Yeah! Don't those villains in Captain EO look a lot like the Borg? They were defeated in 5 minutes.
By dance.
But here's the thing. They look like the Borg, they predate Next Generation, and that was produced by George Lucas. So I just had to put that out there. I don't know why I did that, John,
You're
but...
trying to win this argument?
Yeah, how dare you. Boy, put a ringer on my team. Thank you. So here's what's terrifying about the Borg. The Borg are relentless. There is no stopping them. If you stop some, they will make more and they will come after you. And they will come after you in different guises because they can assimilate any species with any characteristics they want to make themselves a better enemy. So that is terrifying. I like what you said about kind of the unpredictability that's terrifying. Here's the other thing. Nobody knows what the Borg want. All the Borg are doing is just propagating their own species. You know, the Sith are clearly after power, and that's an interesting shot because this other thing the Sith are doing in that guise is working out these complex family issues, the whole daddy thing, you know. But for the Borg, none of this matters. In fact, I'll quote another Star Trek podcast, and instead of talking about Tholians, I'll just say it this way: Borg don't give a shit. No. You know, you've got, it doesn't matter who you are, what you've got, Borg don't give a shit. They're going to assimilate you. No matter what, they are coming after you. And this is a terrifying prospect that in the process, they strip away your humanity, your individuality, everything that makes you you in order to become a cog in a machine. And I'll finalize that by again saying that science greater than magic.
Okay, I'd like to start with two things. First, how many movies ended with the Borg winning? And how many movies ended with the Sith winning? Okay, number two, as a species, we are very, very excellent at dealing with acute threats to our society. When an attacker comes, it's from a direction, and we're very good at meeting that threat. And I think the Star Trek movies are good examples of how we would meet the threat of the Borg. The problem with the Sith is that they are absolutely insidious and behind the scenes and decaying our society, or any society that they're involved in, from within. And so when you have them making these moves we can't see and making slow, incremental steps toward our doom, when they finally react with Order 66, no one's prepared whatsoever. It's a much more insidious threat. I say that with no pun intended whatsoever. And
Tell that to the guys from Wolf 359.
you mean like Cisco? He seemed to come out of that okay. And I don't like the Force. Just because we don't have an explanation for it doesn't mean that it's just magic.
Isn't the explanation midi-chlorians?
No,
From the Star Wars prequels?
midi-chlorians are not the Force. Midi-chlorians are a microscopic life form that allows the Jedi or people attuned to them to better communicate with the Force.
Oh, dear.
Right, what does that mean?
That means that...
Doctor?
Do you want to know what a symbiotic life form is, Doctor?
This just got good.
Look, Doctor, I'm going
Okay.
to get you out of this one because I just want to piggyback on actually what everybody is saying. That, of course, the Borg are a major threat and that they are assimilating other cultures and societies. And I think, of course, when it comes to humanity, that is the biggest threat. When you can completely wipe out culture, that is an incredible threat. However, the Sith have this ability to, not only are they operating on these negative emotions like anger and hate and all this, but it consumes the individual. So you have this individual level destruction of humanity, which I think can be even more powerful. And
It was a good year.
it's a good
The year that guy was born.
It's a good year. So frankly, you know, and if someone were to say, well, the destruction of an individual does not, impact humanity. Well, it can, because, as you can see, Anakin can wipe out an entire Tusken Raider village just based on that level of anger. So it can work on the individual level and on the larger level.
It's fair. All right, we're gonna go.
Not very good at those emotions, are they? No.
We're gonna go deep on this one. I'm not sure the panel can take it. All right. We're gonna go with a morality question. Now, there's something very interesting about these two images here. In one of them, the gentleman on the left is saying, "Wipe them out, all of them," and the other, the gentleman is saying, "Let them die." One is a direct order to destroy everybody, and the other is a passive suggestion that maybe you should let them destroy themselves, or just die away. Psychologically speaking, what are these two guys going through right now? And what is the difference between letting one species die at your own hands and another alone?
Well,
Team wars.
some can argue that there really isn't a difference, that whether it's passive or active, it's still genocide. I think that this moment, so correct me if I'm wrong, but this is Kirk saying that if he does nothing, then the Klingons will die?
Correct.
Is that really any different than Order 66? Is that really any different than, destroying Alderaan? I think that sort of, in terms, if you want to talk about morality, that decision-making sort of sounds the same to me, and it kind of makes me wonder about this character, Kirk, in that this seems to be sort of this fault of his, this split, or this kind of inconsistency with someone who's supposed to be a hero.
With Kirk and with the death of the Klingons, I mean, he's obviously a very damaged individual. I mean, Sidious is after power, and we understand that, but Kirk has got this petty vendetta for the death of his son that he didn't even care about or know about until like 6 months before his death. And for that, he'd want to revenge himself against all Klingons. He's not a balanced individual at all, really. And how interesting would the Star Trek universe be without the Klingons in post-undiscovered country, really?
All right, so here we go. I think there's an important piece of context here that we're missing, and that's that Sidious, the Emperor, the old man in the robe, the angry old man in the robe, who goes around being angry, that is his job. We can pretty much say that, yeah, that is the expected reaction out of him. If he wants somebody to die, he will kill them. And of course, we remember the scene of the Emperor at the end of Return of the Jedi. He's just shooting lightning out of his hands because that's what he's good at. He's, But here's the important thing about Kirk. Okay, Kirk not only has spent a lifetime chasing Klingons around the galaxy because they were the threat, a real threat at a certain time. They also killed his son, which of course is going to damage his perspective of the Klingons. But here's the most important thing about Kirk. Kirk learns from the experiences. Kirk has a team around him, and particularly with McCoy and Spock, but also by the rest of the crew, of opinions that he trusts. And even though he says, let them die, it's immediately Spock who puts him back into line and says, only Nixon could go to China. So if anybody here is going to make a difference, it has to be you. And what do? They do it. He risks his life again to make the bigger piece the more important part of the puzzle here. He makes the idea of galactic peace his single driving point in that movie. And that's admirable. And it means that he shows that beautiful human reaction of being able to learn and being able to be better than himself. You know, it's a lesson from the young Kirk, the Kirk in the Corbomite maneuver, who tells the young ensign, look, you're terrified right now about going over to that ship with Balok because you think that Balok is this big scary monster that just tried to kill us. And Balok did just try to kill us. But your obligation is to live up to what we say we are as humans and go over there and help that thing that almost killed you. So Kirk's been through a lot, and I think we can all respect that he's been through a lot. So as soon as he's reminded that that is his duty, he does his duty. And that is what begins the human-Klingon alliance. So I don't think we can fault him there at all.
That one definitely deserved a hand. You took the words right out of my mouth. I'm just going to mention two things, and a lot of it is how we see the situation. So when you're driving down the freeway and someone cuts you off, you're like, oh, that guy's a bastard, right? But when you do the exact same thing, it's like, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm in a hurry. You know? It's this concept in psychology, it's called the self-serving bias. When it's stuff about us or people we like, we make situational explanations. I cut someone off because I'm in a hurry. When someone else does something, then we say it's that person's fault. So a lot of what we're seeing here has to do with how we see these characters and whether we like them or not. We all like Kirk, so we're really making a situational explanation here. It's not really genocide. It's kind of that same thing as Batman does. I'm not going to kill you, but I don't have to save you. It's kind of the same thing, right? But they're like rationalizing in their head, and we're not seeing it necessarily as murder or genocide. And just like you said, Kirk actually goes and tries to save them so far that he goes to Urapente, and he's doing a lot of stuff to try to save the Klingons. I don't see Sidious doing anything to try to save the Jedi.
He makes out with himself.
That was a great scene.
The Emperor is not going to do that.
No.
Last I checked, going to Urupente wasn't his choice. That wasn't, I don't know. I think this is a totally loaded.
He knew the risk.
This is totally slanted toward Kirk, obviously. It's like, you guys need to defend Kirk, and you guys need to defend the actions of Darth Sidious.
What is going on?
Now, in fairness, the question didn't lean toward which one's the hero. The question was, what's the psychology of the two men? So it's really not about how did they handle it. So if Team Trek didn't answer that question properly, it's up to you guys. All right, so we're going to go on to inclusion and diversity. And what better way to do that than a couple of bars? Which of these franchises handled inclusion and diversity better?
Team Trek.
Go with Team Trek. Yeah, it's your turn.
All right, so Team Trek, we've got this idea not in psychology, we've got this idea in Star Trek, which is infinite diversity and infinite combinations. Right?
Yeah,
let's give it up for Iddick.
Yeah.
So Iddick is this idea that sort of pervades all of Star Trek. And so what's the psychology of infinite diversity and infinite combinations? We know exactly how you overcome prejudice. There's a great meta-analysis, which basically means it was a big study of a bunch of studies that have been done, about 500 to be specific. And what they found is overcoming prejudice comes down to three basic things. One, learning information about another group of people. Two, having exposure to other group of people. And three, developing empathy for other group of people. For other people. We've seen this happen in America with desegregation. That's exactly what happened over there. And there's fantastic Star Trek episodes about this. There's the Next Generation episode, which is called The Enemy, where Geordi and a Romulan are trapped on a planet, and they're supposed to be these enemies, hence the title, Enemy. And what they do is they learn about each other, they develop empathy for each other, and they overcome the prejudice. And there's so many episodes that go on and on about this. That's strike number one against Star Wars. Strike two comes in representation. And it's incredibly important to make sure that the show you're watching is representative of the population to which it is created for. So what we've seen in Star Trek, going all the way from the original series, is breaking these barriers of inclusion. Star Trek had an African-American female, had an Asian-American male, characters that wouldn't be seen on other shows doing important things. And if you go on to Star Trek Next Generation, you have Beverly Crusher serving as a doctor. Deep Space Nine, we have the first African-American captain. We have Voyager with the first woman captain. So all of these things have been amazing, and Star Trek has really broken through all of these inclusion areas. However, Here is strike against Star Trek. And I don't usually debate against Trek, but I'm going to have to do it.
Choose your words carefully.
Here is where Star Trek has failed. Where is the LGBT Star Trek character? Where is the LGBT Star Trek character? We're about 30 years too late on this. It's absolute failure. I don't hold Star Wars to the same standards. They only have 6 movies, whereas we have over 500 hours of produced Star Trek. But the time has come a long time ago for an LGBT character on Star Trek. It's the final frontier of inclusion that we have to cross.
I wanted to actually jump in just to quickly kind of note that while it's important to have representation, on the TV show and as well as the films, what you notice though is that it doesn't really work in the context of the universe. So for instance, in the Federation flagship, where are all the aliens? Most of them are human. You've got one Vulcan who can pass as human and who they have actually covered his ears up to pass him as human. And if that's supposed to be a representation of all of these multicultural worlds and universes, you have the people in the position of change and power and influence, they're all human. Whereas in Star Wars you have a lot of different aliens and species that are in positions of power and positions of influence. You have Yoda, you have Yaddle, you have Mon Mothma, you have Admiral Akbar. So in the context of the Star Wars universe, you have all of these fantastic diversity across aliens, across planets, and I think that makes more sense in the context of the narrative. And what I like about that is that it does not stop to tell you a story and have like the half face painted white and the half face painted black. It shows you the harmonious, and of course they're in battle, and of course they're at war, but it shows you that these different types of people are actually coexisting, and it doesn't have this explanation for it. Maybe that's what the future is like.
Well, let's just be honest here. Part of that's budgetary concern. That happening. Producing TV, very different from the scale of producing a movie. When you get into the movies, you do have more truly alien characters. And, there are Federation ships that are based on Earth that have a primarily human crew. There are Federation ships that are from Vulcan that have a primarily Vulcan crew. There is crossover. We don't always get to see all of that. But I want to go back to your original point and say, yeah, I agree with everything that you say, of course. And I'll just point out something here on the images that you chose, Brian or Andrea. I like a lot of different bars, restaurants, kind of thing. Quarks looks, of course, very inviting, and you're there on Deep Space Nine, and all kinds of species, all kinds of creatures from anywhere could really join in. I'm a little worried that at the cantina, I run a very high risk of losing a limb, or being shot by a smuggler with a hair trigger. And I believe, if I can quote directly from that scene, he doesn't like you. I don't like you either. This is not really the most welcoming way to bring people into a bar. So yeah, Star Trek definitely goes out of its way to present a kind of diversity, and Star Trek is, in many instances, about that diversity, about humans and really any of the species being dealt with growing beyond their limitations and embracing that diversity. There is something to be said for Star Wars having that on screen from the very beginning, but it's usually not about that diversity. It's just sort of an element of, there it is, yeah.
One thing I would say about the bars, though, is that you're looking at two very different classes of clientele that are coming to these bars. You've got Tatooine, which is at the ass end of space. And it's literally the worst place in the galaxy, and Obi-Wan tells Luke before he goes in, he's like, this place is awful. We really have to go here, but it's, we shouldn't be going here. And Quarks is this affluent bar with a clientele full of well-educated science officers, which isn't terribly representative of the general populace in the United States whatsoever. And I'm not sure where I'm going with that one.
And the cantina is?
No, the cantina is like a rough and tumble, like blue-collar hangout. And it's more charming. I mean, look at the bar that McCoy went into in Star Trek 3. That's like the epitome of terrible bars. Why are we arguing about bars? Like, Star Trek has bad bars.
It's late on Friday. I can't.
Yeah.
I will say the DS9 is on the new frontier. It is not, it's a frontier area. Julian Bashir went there because he wanted to practice frontier medicine. It is out there. No one wants to be there.
Except for all the Starfleet officers like Bashir.
Besides him, no one wants to do that.
But as far as inclusion and diversity though goes, I think Star Wars really does have an advantage in the positions of power argument. I mean, look at the admirals that we have. We've got human admirals, Admiral Akbar, that are aliens, and every single admiral in Star Trek is like evil and turns against like all of Starfleet.
Not Admiral Janeway, or Admiral Kirk, or Admiral Nagura.
Okay,
But there's three.
What about like all the ones who set up like Section 31 or all of the guys who are like doing all this clandestine stuff because or the ones that
They're misguided.
okay okay we can move on.
Yes, we can. All right. So, last question that we have here, round 5. We've got the United Federation of Planets versus the Galactic Empire. Both of these would be the controlling governments and could definitely be linked to very real-world type governments. What are those psychological aspects of those governments, and how do they best represent their franchises? Trek went first, so we'll go with wars.
Do we have 2 hours for this question? This is like, so as not to really kind of go on and on, I'll sort of focus on the realism of the galactic. You're talking about the galactic empire, not the republic, right?
Yeah, the word says empire on the screen.
We don't want to go into that.
I think the spirit of it is which what lessons we're trying to be taught.
Yes.
With both.
It really is in the realism of that kind of government. Of course, historically, we do not have to go into the comparisons, but psychologically speaking, there are some important reasons why the empire might be more realistic. So if you're sitting here thinking, like, how would they be able to execute Order 66? How are these people able to blow up entire planets? Like, what is the psychology behind that? Because there are a lot of people on the bad side, and they're all organized, and they're all sort of willing to do this. Has anyone heard of the Stanford prison experiment? Can I just kind of see? So I don't have to go through all that, but you know that there's this idea in psychology of de-individuation, where if you have things like masks and helmets and things that sort of influence the ability of people to recognize you, anonymity, that you will be more likely to engage in transgressions. You will be more likely to exhibit abnormal behavior and sometimes aggressive behavior. That has to do not just with the anonymity, but also the fact that you're in an organized group. It has to do with the fact that there's sort of a weaker alliance or those that cannot really protect themselves. So that is that.
I think both series are actually really good at showing us something that we need to learn. I think Star Trek is really good about showing us what we can be at our best when we put aside greed and we put aside capitalism and we put aside all of these things and pursue what's highest among men as a species. And I think that that's admirable, but I think that it's a little pie in the sky. I think the Empire illustrates something that's much darker but much more realistic. The Empire maneuvers with moneyed interests. It maneuvers with lobbying efforts. It maneuvers with all of these horrible things that we're watching play out on the news day after day, regardless of regardless of who's in power, there's this giant machine working behind the scenes to benefit them and to harm us. And I think that the lessons learned there with how the Empire is portrayed and how you watch the best intentions of someone like Anakin Skywalker turning into the evil perpetrated by Darth Vader shows it's a much more valuable lesson. It's nice to see what we can achieve, but it's also important to learn how we can not take that path to evil.
What you just said reminded me of the opening crawl of episode 1, and as soon as they started talking about taxation, my eyes rolled in the back of my head. I was like, oh my God, no, it's not about that, is it? There's something about the Empire that is obviously terrifying, and it appeals to this sort of authoritarian streak. So I guess if you totally devalue your individuality and really have a hankering for that kind of oppression, then sign up for the Empire today. They have some lovely white armor that will look good on you. But there is something about the Federation, sort of modeled after the establishment of the United Nations, that there can be this better future where we can celebrate diversity, like we just talked about. We can maintain a kind of individuality and cultural identity, but we can also work together for the bigger things that are worth working toward. So seeing those two on the screen, I think it's almost a little unfair. I just, knee-jerk probably, but the Federation is the system that I would prefer to live under.
But again, we're going under the psychology of the two governments.
Sure.
Not
well,
which one would I rather live.
Well, right, and I think the psychology of it is, the Empire is making this appeal to authority, and there is no room for self-determination and individuality. I think it's the complete opposite with the Federation. There is a hierarchy, there is a structure in place, but there is a kind of inclusion and a self-determination there that is just completely anathema to the other side.
So I really like what Brian said over here. They're both very complementary to each other, and I think that they're both in extremes, but they're both important messages, and they're two sides of the same coin. So who here has seen Trek Nation, the documentary? All right, everyone go and watch it on Netflix. I don't know why you haven't seen it. So Roddenberry, the son of Gene Roddenberry, did this fantastic documentary. You can stream it off Netflix. But he interviews George Lucas on it. And it's a fantastic interview because George Lucas talks about how much he liked Star Trek until he got to the point where he couldn't say he liked Star Trek because he did Star Wars. And there's also an interview with Gene Roddenberry talking about how much he liked Star Wars. These are two very complementary stories about the Federation and about the Empire. When you look at the Empire, just like Andrea was saying, obedience to authority, the Stanley Milgram shock experiment that some of you might know about, that's definitely playing out over here. Some recent research for you, looking at the Iraq War and support towards the Iraq War. People who had felt more anger were more likely to support the Iraq War. People who felt more anxiety were less likely to support it. And the Empire definitely runs on the sense of anger. What is it, Order 66? Is that the thing? That was all about anger, right? You also have a lot of conformity. There's a reason why all the stormtroopers are dressed in white. By the way, I've got you guys on here. Are stormtroopers clones? I've always wondered that, or are the clone troopers just the clone? Some? Some and some. Okay, I always wondered that. Thank you, sir. So going on to Star Trek, one of the big psychological ideas are superordinate goals. There's this classic study in psychology. It's the kind of stuff we can't do anymore because now we have institutional review boards that say that stuff is unethical. But there's a psychologist who got a group of kids and made them hate each other. So this group hated this group. And they just hated each other. There was violence and aggression and all of that. And then on one of the later days at the summer camp, he made them work together on a goal that they couldn't achieve separately. They had to collaborate. When they were forced to work on this superordinate goal, those problems, the prejudice, the violence, the conflict, it disappeared. That's the United Federation of Planets. It's focusing on these big goals that we need a lot of people to contribute to work together to achieve. That's why the Vulcans, the humans, the Tellarites, the Andorians.
Sure.
Yep.
All of the above.
That's why they all came together and formed the Federation. So both work together. They're both important stories. I like both. Both are good.
Awesome. That's what we've got. Let's go to your questions. I know you have them.
Oh dear. Oh dear. All right. We're ready.
This will be something of a lightning round a little bit because, we want to get through as many questions as you guys might have, and so you guys...
Keep it short. So we'll keep it short.
Right on.
I was wondering if you guys could address the issue of familial relationships, the family, the idea of family, both in strife and in support. How do you each deal with the sense of family?
I think Kirk probably has a lot of families. He just maybe doesn't know about them all.
But he doesn't know any of them.
I could talk a little bit about Star Wars. I think Star Wars is actually one of the things for me as a kid that actually helped me cope with a really ugly childhood. I had an abusive father, and I was always fascinated by the idea that someone so evil could, at the end of the day, find enough love in his heart for his son to turn back to the good side. That was something that I always clinged to as a kid that got me through my childhood years. And that, more than anything, like, I don't care what anybody else has to say about any of the other familial relationships. And yes, they're dysfunctional, but I think everyone has dysfunctional familial relationships. Star Wars was really important in that regard for me, and I think for a lot of people.
I'll sneak in there real quickly. We could have a whole panel on that. The one that really sticks out in my mind, say what you will about J.J. Abrams and the new movies, one thing that's been really great about them is how Spock has been depicted. And you get to familiar relationships, one of the big ideas about kids and parents is resiliency. What can parents do to help their kids be resilient against stress, things like that? Spock is constantly discriminated against for being not Vulcan enough or not human enough. One of the nice things you see in the 2009 Star Trek movie is the parents provide this warmth stance where it's like you can discover whoever you want to be. We will still be there in support of you. That is one of the core components of resilience.
Great.
I'm sorry, but I do feel compelled to chime in on the point of diversity regarding Star Trek, while allowing for the difference between a mostly film canon and series canon, and for the Enterprise flagship being mostly human. I'd like to point out that Deep Space Nine had Trill, Klingon, Ferengi, Bajoran, Cardassian allies in the end, Klingon allies in the end. Not just diversity, but equity. Voyager had Latina Klingon, an indigenous Maquis, Neelix, in an interspecies partnership, as was B'Elanna with Tom Paris, and a black Vulcan.
Tuvok.
Tuvok, thank you. So I do feel compelled to point out that Trek, as it went on as a series of programs, expanded its reach while allowing for the lack of an LGBT character, which I agree is sorely needed, but I just need to point that out. Thank you.
There's an interesting thing about the LGBT. I don't want to get too promotional, I'm so sorry, but on a recent Mission Log supplemental, we interviewed David Gerald about that specifically because this was a huge fight in the production office of Next Gen, and it's unfortunate that that never really happened. Richard Arnold, who was one of Gene Roddenberry's assistants, said that one of the other arguments behind the scenes was, well, if we depict this, how do we depict this? How do we know who is the gay character on Star Trek? Because how do we play it? Do we make something that's stereotyped? That would be wrong too. So,
Jadzia had...
I'm sorry, who?
Yeah, I was going to say,
yeah.
Jadzia had some encounters, but that was more...
It's not...
That wasn't positive as much as it was.
It's not straightforward enough. And you depict it the same way you depict any heterosexual relationship.
Yeah.
Next question.
Hey, wait a minute. I'm moderating this panel.
Brian says next.
All that imperialism
Next
is
question.
rubbing off.
You mentioned a second ago stereotypes, and I know we talked about inclusion and diversity. And I was curious about both of these, between 6 movies and then 28 seasons, and I think 12 movies with Star Trek. Both of them have had kind of dark spots as far as treating something in more of a racist way, I think. And I think that a lot of people would argue that the Ferengi are somewhat kind of caricatures in Star Trek. And then Watto and kind of the elephant in the room that hasn't been mentioned, Jar Jar in Star Wars. And I was wondering if you guys have any, I know, sorry to bring it up.
Way to make a crowd turn against you.
But I'm just curious if you guys have any particular insights on just the racism in the two, or some kind of just the stereotypes that each of them have, and which one is, I mean, worse.
Can I take the Jar Jar thing, okay? Here's the thing with Jar Jar, okay? Jar Jar, I mean, for one, he is a stereotype of whatever you assign a stereotype to him. For two, Jar Jar tells a very excellent story and lesson, and this is a lesson I've talked to with my kids about. Jar Jar's obnoxious, right? No one's going to argue about that, right? Jar Jar's obnoxious. Well, what is the one thing, who's the one person who says, like, you know, we should probably be nice to this guy even though he's obnoxious? It's Qui-Gon. Even Qui-Gon, right at the beginning, is like, yeah, this guy kind of sucks. but he realizes that there is value to him as an individual. And through the course of the film is the only person who keeps him there and allows him to flourish as an individual and is nice to him. And it's Jar Jar who brings the Naboo and the Gungans together as a result of them seeing that inherent value in him as an individual. So it's a very good lesson to learn. I'm done on the Jar Jar issue. Next.
Real quick about the Ferengi. Completely agree with you. In TNG's complete stereotypes. Also Voyager, they're pretty much stereotypes. In DS9, we get a nice, complex representation of who they are. I hated Ferengi by season 7 of DS9. I love Quark.
Yeah, there's kind of a thing there that's the limitation of production. You got 48 minutes to create a show, create a character, and very often Star Trek will do a shorthand for what that character is, just to get across an idea, create the conflict, and then resolve it. And then what's cool is weeks and months later, the fans say, oh, we really like that, we really like this character, and then you bring them back, and something that Trek is really good about is then expanding that character and giving those alien races a real life and complexity and diversity. And yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of. By the time you get to the end of DS9, you've got a whole complex life for these Ferengi, and they don't always play out in kind of what would be the obvious choice.
Real quick, the Ferengi were supposed to be the new villains of TNG, and people hated them so much, that's how we got the Borg. They're like, we gotta make something better. So we got Borg in season 2.
Somebody went to Captain EO in the meantime. They're like,
Good. Next question.
Speaking of the Borg, the first point made against the Borg was a question of how many movies did the Borg win? Well, the whole conflict there was simply, which is the greater threat? If the Sith can win a few movies, and the Borg, if they won, would destroy everything and there wouldn't be any winning, doesn't that automatically mean that the Borg are the greater threat anyway?
The Sith did destroy everything, though. Like, Yoda goes off into hiding, like, with his tail between his legs.
You can't go back from the Borg.
I like that.
Can't you?
I like
What happened with 7 of 9?
It's a very disguised. It's a comment in the form of a question.
And that's what happens when you wear a red shirt.
Here's the thing. For the Borg, all you need to have the Borg win is 1 nanoprobe. You could wipe out every fleet of Borg cubes. It doesn't matter. You got 1 nanoprobe left. Guess what? The Borg are coming back. So we can.
The Sith are the same way. They thought they were gone for 1,000 generations.
If you have 1 midichlorian left, they'll...
Okay, so first a comment. You made a comment about how the Star Wars might have borrowed from the Borg idea. I'm pretty sure Cybermen are basically Borg and they were around beforehand. So I don't know if that can actually be played. And my question is, if taking into historical context when these scripts were actually written, and maybe the social pressures they were put under to maybe show what's going on in the real world, would that change any of your guys' responses? Like, for instance, the gay and lesbian kind of idea, that might have not been an issue at the time when these scripts were written, rather than other racial issues were a bigger social concern. So would that change any of your guys' opinions to what you've said?
Somewhat. I think there might be people in this room and people in society that would say that was an issue then. Maybe not as big of an issue, but it certainly was an issue.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the time is now for our next Star Wars.
How dare you?
Trek. for both movies, because we both have 2 new movies coming out for us to finally see the LGBT character. But I think you're right. If you look at the era and the context in which these existed, then even then Star Trek has pushed the envelope.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at original series Star Trek, you're talking about before Stonewall. You know, so this was something that was not depicted no matter what on TV. By the time you got to Next Gen, 87, our understanding of the AIDS crisis was 4 years old. And I think what was happening, partly, this is a very complex and very big answer, but partly what was happening also is you had an older group of writers now. These are people 20 years removed from the original series, now trying to recreate this show. And you kind of have to put yourself in their shoes. What's on their radar? What do they want to get across? And then is there a pressure, I think what you were indicating, coming from studios, just coming from the idea of distribution? Will it play in Tulsa? Will it play in Birmingham, Alabama? Will it play here?
We can't touch on this topic. Let's touch on that topic.
Yeah, and part of that may be even a self-imposed thing.
I think there's a couple of things at play here. One, you kind of have to consider what they were written as. You know, Star Trek was that episode of the week, let's teach people a lesson kind of show, and Star Wars was, let's show people a story that shows how they can tap into that hero's journey in the human spirit, which is much more individual, and Star Trek is much more societal. And so Star Wars, again, very complementary, taking them together with Star Trek where you have the lessons about society, and Star Wars with the lessons about the internal spirit there. I think you've got a very whole picture of what things should be and how we could advance.
And John, one of the things you mentioned is actually a problem with both franchises, where we had too many of the same producers in charge of Star Trek throughout the whole 90s. You had a small group of people. That was a problem with the prequels, is George Lucas had complete control. This is why the Star Trek reboot, I think, is really interesting. It's also interesting that the people in charge of the Star Trek reboot are now in charge of Star Wars, so we'll see how that plays out.
I think that's going to turn out really well.
I agree.
I hope so too, yeah.
Next question.
Hi, I have question for the Trek guys predominantly, but sorry. One of the characters that's always spoken to me personally has been Data and his journey to create identity, and the way he seemed to do it on the show predominantly was to emulate humanity. You know, the episode that always stuck out to me was the one where he sits in the bar and he tries to learn how to be a comedian and to understand comedy, and it just goes miserably. But, you know, in terms of identity development models and almost kind of like going through this childlike state to being this functioning individual, I was wondering, you know, what predominantly your thoughts were on how realistic that was in kind of an unrealistic circumstance.
The quick answer is check out episode 1 on YouTube, because Andrea and I really went back and forth with each other on the Data question. But the larger answer is, if you look at season 1, the pilot episode, which is called Encounter at Farpoint. Yeah. Thank you, sir.
That's why I'm here.
And if you look at Data there, he's really kind of this childlike figure. And if you look at him by the time we get to Nemesis, he's in a very different place. So he does sort of follow that trajectory of development that we see between childhood and adolescence, and sort of the identity kind of figuring out who you are and all of that. So Data follows that path pretty well, actually.
Yeah, I don't really have an answer for that, but this is something that is kind of an interesting point to really look at. And in a couple of years, when we start doing Next Gen on Mission Log, it'll be an interesting story to follow. I think the question here is, for an artificial intelligence, a manufactured being, is the right trajectory for him to try to be more human? Are we applying the wrong kind of expectation on him to say you should be more human? But the other element in there is choice. Data's choice is to try to become that just because of his exposure to humans. So like I said, I don't have an answer, but I'm interested to see where this goes.
Is that a function of proximity?
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
Well, certainly in the last episode of this panel, we talked about data in terms of artificial intelligence, but I certainly see this character as representing sort of like what makes us us, in the sense that we actually have to think about certain rules when we're learning more about data. And I'm not talking about like, well, this is how you sneeze in front of people, or this is how you play cards with people, but things like empathy and things like, well, when someone else is hurting, what am I supposed to do? And I think that for some of us, those are important psychological sort of processes to kind of recognize and think about.
I'm not sure he had a choice necessarily to try to be more human-like. I mean, he's built to look like a human because it's easier for him to interface with those he would be interfacing, and so I think I'm not sure that's a choice for him. I think that's him trying to blend in better, to be less noticed and take attention off of himself.
Good point. Thank you. All right, we're going to go through these last two questions very quickly because these nice gentlemen will let us go over a little bit. Want to go home, I'm sure. So.
Thank you. We love you. Nice gentlemen.
All right, one of my most favorite characters has always been Q from a character standpoint, a storyline standpoint. I would just like to know what you guys think would be his Star Wars equivalent, or if there even would be one.
There's no one like Q. I mean, this guy's omnipotent. He's incredibly funny. He loves to torment Jean-Luc. There's no one like him.
No.
He's one of a kind.
Not in the movies or the cartoons or anything. No, I mean, but I think Star Wars might be cheapened by a Q presence. I think the physics and the reality of how the Star Wars universe works in a very self-contained way, and in Star Trek, it's interesting to see him turning things upside down. But because of the stories that are told in Star Wars, I don't think that would be appropriate.
Great, thank you.
I still think that's 1 point for Star Trek, though.
It's funny, so many of the questions have been for Team Trek.
That's because they were confused by your answer.
These guys got to.
I would ask though, and I realize I'm impartial, but I would ask though, would Q qualify as magic?
No.
He doesn't even have.
Next question.
He doesn't even have midi-chlorians to explain it.
So one of my favorite moments in Star Wars is when Han Solo swivels around and says, "Now I owe you one." And then one of my favorite moments in Star Trek is when they all go camping together in Yosemite. So I was going to ask which. No, and then the rest of the movie is awful.
He roast marshmallows.
Which franchise do you think does friendship better?
Coming from the man with the Star Trek shirt, that is a fantastic final question.
Okay. Well, I just didn't know if anybody else was going to jump up. What? Okay. No. This is going to take a second to get to. Okay. Luke Skywalker in The Empire Strikes Back, right? He's training on Dagobah, and he's told that the entire fate of the galaxy is on his shoulders. And if he leaves because he's seen a vision of his friends hurt, if he leaves, the entire galaxy will unravel almost undoubtedly. And he says, you know what? My friends are more important.
No, you go right ahead.
Captain Kirk is climbing the mountain with his super-powered shoes. And he starts falling. Or no, he's climbing. He doesn't have the shoes. Spock has the super-powered shoes. Kirk is falling, and he's caught by Spock, and they're reminiscing about it as they're eating McCoy's brandy beans. And Kirk says, I knew I wasn't going to die today because I knew my friends were here. And then he dies with Picard. And they're not friends, so it holds up in continuity. I think the answer to your question is both. I mean, the friendships in both shows are fantastic.
You just wanted to call that a draw.
We
We'll
appreciate
leave it to the
everybody
audience.
We appreciate everybody coming, and thank you for the panelists. Now it's time to decide. Yeah, you only get one shot at this, so. All right, guys. Team Star Trek. Judged by volume, not duration. Team Star Wars. Wow. I'm pretty sure the series is now tied between the two of you. Star Wars, congratulations. Thank you, guys. Thank you, panelists. Everybody, have a great night. Mr. John Champion. And finally, the other psychologist on the panel. He's known around the country as the Jedi Knight of Psychology. Maybe not.
That's cool. That's
Maybe
cool.
didn't.
It's a lot cooler title than what we had in Star Trek.
Star Trek?
Like yeoman?
Let's start
Yeah.
keeping tabs now on.
He's also completing his postdoctoral fellowship at the NYU Langone Medical Center. And in his free time, likes to write for Brian Knows Best. BrainKnowsBest.com in hopes that it creates a love for psychology, similar to what Star Trek did for him. So, Dr. Ali Mattu. This is sort of how this one works. We're going to throw out a series of questions to you guys. Psychologists have the book learning, and our two experts can help them out with a lot of the canon, and not that they need a lot of the help, but we like to have 4 people on the panel. And they're 4 great people. So we're going to ask you guys a series of questions. We'll start out with one team. The other team gets an opportunity to respond. All the back and forth just takes time. So think of your answers wisely before we move on. And then we'll open it up to a Q&A. And at the end of the night, one of these 2 franchises will walk out of here, crown the victor of Comic-Con 2013. If it's any, if you need any backstory, Star Trek may have eked out a win at WonderCon. So they're out for, Star Wars is out for blood.
Yeah.
All right, so in the immortal words of the late great Apollo Creed, ding, ding. Round 1. Vulcan versus Jedi. Now, we both know that these 2 cultures very much into harnessing the emotions, particularly that of anger. Which one do you think, psychologically speaking, leads to a more healthy way of... They're answering the questions. Which one do you think leads to a healthier way of life? We'll actually start with Team Wars.
Can I just jump in here? Can I quickly just ask, who's here for Star Wars? Yeah! Okay.
Dear God.
Who's here for Star Trek?
It's always, it might always be best to err on the side of not doing that, just in case.
I know. Well, so let's jump into this first question. I think that what comes to mind as far as these sort of 2 ways of regulating emotion, the Jedi actually are doing it right, and I'll explain why.
No, she did.
There's actually a science behind this. So what the Jedi are actually
is. Oh, I'm sorry, and there's a photo of you.
And Batman.
The
Apparently.
Gotham portion.
He's like eerily looking at me.
He is an author. He is an author. You can find his next book this year. It is a pulpy sci-fi Western novel called The Serpent's Head. He's also a journalist, having walked the Star Wars beat for more than 5 years as the editor-in-chief of Big Shiny Robot. He's also written for Star Wars Insider and the official Star Wars website. Mr. Brian Young. He's also one of the hottest geek guys of 2013.
You guys used that photo?
I know, right? Yeah.
Okay.
It's Comic-Con After Dark.
Yes.
This gentleman is he is the co-producer and co-host of Mission Log, the podcast from Roddenberry Entertainment. It analyzes every episode of Star Trek over its 45-plus years. He's also the co-producer and co-host of DVD Geeks.
Yeah.
Just one. He's also a
Star Trek panel is off. It's all DVD.
He's also quite the accomplished commercial and corporate video production artist. Really is what it comes down to. Having worked on bonus features for both Shout Factory, if you were in the panel before that, you know that name, and also with CBS on the Star Trek Next Generation Blu-rays as well as the Enterprise Blu-rays.
Doing is they're regulating their emotions, so they're using their ability to cultivate and embrace positive emotions, usually for pro-social reasons. And they do experience negative emotions like anger and fear and all that stuff. And they know that if you operate on those negative emotions, that leads to the dark side, which could be, antisocial behavior and other things that are not pro-social. So they actually learn to cultivate positive emotions and sort of they manage negative emotions. They don't totally avoid them, but they recognize them, they identify them, and then they manage them. Whereas the Vulcan folk, the Vulcan folk.
They're a species, Andrea. They're not folk.
They actually, it would be different if they didn't have the capacity to experience emotions, but they do. And their culture avoids and represses all emotion. And we know as psychologists that when you repress emotion and inhibit all of these emotions, that it actually can sort of build up. And, it sort of makes sense that after a very long time, that can lead to distress and sort of this negative experience. And, this whole Pon-farr business is just an example of how crazy things can get if you do not allow yourself to experience those emotions.
I think when you look at Jedi versus Vulcan, I think because they are a completely different species, they're not a very good model for people to try to glean lessons from, because we're not built biologically or physiologically like they are or portend to be. And Jedi are human, presumably, but...
It's officially Comic-Con After Hours, so who here's hammered?
Yes!
Whoops. My kind of people. We wanted to kick off, for starters, welcome and thank you for coming to the Psychology of Star Trek versus Star Wars, Episode 2. By the way, for clarification, that's not all of Star Trek versus just Attack of the Clones. Just kidding. It's, this is actually round 2. It's a rematch of sorts between two of these, or the two psychologists on the panel. They started off this really popular series at WonderCon this year, and they weren't quite done. So we decided to pitch it to Comic-Con, a much larger convention, and a much larger potential for bloodshed between the two factions. So I like what I'm seeing here. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. She has a PhD in clinical psychology. She has spoken at several conventions about trauma, resilience, and psychological recovery amongst comic book, fictional heroes and villains in general. She's also the curator of the website underthemaskonline.com, where she goes on and on about all the psychological stuff you want to know about your favorite heroes and villains. And her real passions live in Gotham City and in a galaxy far, far away. Dr. Andrea Letamendi.